Welcome to Health Focus, where we focus on your health. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Anderson, and today we're focusing on drug-related crimes. You might say, well, why? Because that's so important for the health of our community, for individuals, for our schools, for our children, and for our entire population. And we have a fantastic guest to discuss this with, the Senior Law Enforcement Officer of Solano County, District Attorney Krishna Abrams. District Attorney, it's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And would you agree that when you're talking about drugs, you really can't dissect it out as being just a legal issue or just a medical issue? It crosses over the borders.
I completely agree. We see so much of it in my profession.
And I know that when I was training in New York City, it was at the height of the crack epidemic. And at that time, entire communities were destroyed, not just by the drug use, but by the crime, by the disruption of families and everything that went with it.
I know, and I see it in a lot of the crimes that we charge and we prosecute throughout this county. Is we see a lot of the drug use and alcohol use that definitely enhances whatever conflicts were already going on, and a lot of times escalates things from being just argumentative to then physical and then violent. So we see it as a real problem.
I remember learning when I was in medical school and I did a month on forensic pathology that among people who are killed or commit suicide, the percentage that have drugs in their system, particularly the people who are killed, it's quite high. It's over half. In your experience, when we have violent crimes, as we've had recently, even here in Vallejo, we were talking off air, and I know that we've had some serious crimes recently. Do you see drugs and alcohol as being something that maybe disinhibits people?
I think definitely. And I think, when we see domestic violence, where you'll have a relationship where there's problems in the relationship, whether it's financial, whether it's intimacy, whether there's an allegation of that there's cheating going on in the relationship, and then you add drugs and alcohol to the relationship, that fuels the fire for the perpetrator to become a lot more violent. I know personally, I've tried a lot of homicide cases, and two of the worst cases that I think I've tried a few years ago was called the thrill kill, and these people would get high on methamphetamine and they wanted to go out and kill people to see what it would feel like. It was one of the most disturbing murder cases I've ever tried. And I remember another case where a victim was just going to exchange her purse at Macy's at the mall in Fairfield, and the person was high on methamphetamine and went and took a bat to her. He thought that she had money because she had a Michael Kors purse, and he took a bat to her head and killed her right there at the mall.
I remember that case. It was in the parking lot.
It was.
Solano Mall off Travis Boulevard there.
It was.
Now, in looking at your website, I know that you recently had something called the Walk Stroll to End Domestic Violence. It was in your December newsletter. Does that kind of outreach make a difference in trying to deal with drugs and alcohol in the community?
I feel like it does, because you hear so many of the personal stories of people that have survived those domestic violence relationships, and you hear what's gone on in their relationship. So I think the more outreach we do, the more that people understand, I think it makes a difference.
So I think of law enforcement as being primarily arresting people, trying them, convicting them, and so forth, but there's more to it than that, obviously. It appears that you are also dedicated to outreach and education. What do you view as being the role of law enforcement in dealing with drugs and alcohol as a societal problem? Just in general terms, what is the role of law enforcement?
Well, I feel like there's a two-prong approach, especially today. Back in the day, we were kind of reactionary as prosecutors, but I feel like we're a lot more proactive today. So I feel like there's the prosecution element, but then there's the prevention, education, outreach element. Is that we want to get the word out of why we don't want to use drugs and alcohol, but at the same time, we want to prosecute so that there's a deterrent, so that there's consequences, there's accountability. So it's kind of a two-prong approach, I would say, today.
Okay, how about if we run through a few specific drugs? Let's start with alcohol. I mean, it's been around for thousands of years. It's a part of a lot of cultures, the Mediterranean cultures with wine and so forth. And yet we have anywhere from 30 to 50,000 deaths in vehicles a year in the US. I feel that the tolerance for drinking and driving has really changed, not just as a legal matter, but just as a cultural issue over the last 30, 40 years, probably starting with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. But do you have any comments on that, just the general societal perception of drinking and driving?
I think that people are very, very opposed to drinking and driving, and I think because there's so many other resources you have available to you today, whether you're young or old, or doesn't matter, is that, you have Uber, you have Lyft, you have a parent, you have, a responsible adult, somebody, or you have a designated driver. There's no excuse to be drinking and driving so that you're such impaired and that you can't operate your vehicle safely. So we are very aggressive in terms of our DUI prosecution, but again, like I said, we're also very proactive in trying to do outreach on it. I checked our stats last year. We filed almost 1,500 DUI cases in 1 year. Period of time. We have DUI trials going out every single week, misdemeanor DUIs. We've gotten great verdicts by all of our young team on our misdemeanor team, because I think people are saying, we don't want you drinking and driving. You not only put yourself at risk when you're out there, but you're putting everybody else that's innocent out on your roadways at risk as well. So for me, there's, we can aggressively go after drunk drivers in terms of if you're repeat offenders. There's called what's a Watson advisement, which is if you continue to drink and drive, knowing it could take somebody's life and you still do it, that if you get in a DUI after you've already been in one and you kill someone, we actually could prosecute you for murder, and we have done that at our office. So we look at every case, we look at all the facts and we look at each case specifically, but in those cases that are very, very egregious, we have and we will file homicide charges on somebody who is a repeat offender while they're drinking and driving on the roadway.
What do you think about the prospect of maybe having self-driving cars as a way for people to get home safely from a night out on the town without driving while drunk? I realize that's maybe not totally here yet, but I actually wonder if that might be a long-term part of the solution.
Well, I think they have those cars in San Francisco. My son and I saw that, I think Waymo. But there's so many different alternatives to get home safely that you do not have to get in your car drinking and driving. You do not have to do that.
You can take a cab, Uber, Lyft. Can you be in the back of a Waymo vehicle and be drunk, or is that against the law?
Well, no. If you've been drinking and you're getting a safe way home, you could be drunk if you're drunk in public, like you're doing something that's you're causing a danger to somebody else or yourself. But if you are just been drinking and you get an Uber ride home, you're allowed to do that.
Are you reaching out to teenagers who are just taking driver's ed and driver's training to kind of tell them about this from the start?
I'm glad you say that, because we have this huge outreach program right now. It's called the S-Cubed campaign, and it's Be Safe, Be Sober, Be Smart. And it talks, and we are out at junior high schools, we're out at the high schools all throughout their county. And our goal is to try to hit every high school that we can in Solano County. We have this great public safety message. I actually brought a copy of it for you here today. It was my goal to get a message to the youth that isn't just like a parent talking to you, a law enforcement officer talking to you, but students telling students the dangers of drinking and driving and why you don't want to do that and why you want to make a responsible decision. There's a case that came out of our county, Solano County, years ago where it was prom, and these kids decided not to go to prom and they wanted to go out and just have fun, and they were drinking and driving and having fun, and they thought they were living the life, and they were capturing it all on their cell phones, and you watch them in their car, and within seconds, boom, car crashes, 2 dead. And it's been a long road back for those that survived that accident, and we actually have reached out to one of the survivors of that accident, and she was courageously enough came forward to be part of our public safety message, hoping that that message of like, don't do this. I just lost 2 of my best friends. And we go out to the high schools, and so we hope that if that can save lives, then we're being successful in the schools.
Yeah, it seems that every year there's several heartbreaking stories of teenagers who are just starting the best years of their lives who get killed in accidents like this, and it really, I think it moves all of us to read those stories. Let's switch gears, Counselor, to cannabis. Now, my understanding, well, I can tell you as a medical doctor that cannabis and THC can alter your spatial and perception and your perception of time, particularly leading people to do things like drive unusually slowly and so forth and just be uncoordinated. So we all know that you can be impaired driving due to cannabis. But what I'm not clear about is how does a police officer, and how do you as a district attorney determine if someone is impaired? Do we have any something like a blood alcohol level for THC? I don't believe we do, but I don't know.
We don't have a specific threshold for the use of cannabis while you're driving, but what the officers will look at if you're pulled over is we can have a drug recognition expert do some field sobriety tests out there on the field at the stop of the car that would look to see whether you look like that you're under the influence of, say, cannabis as opposed to alcohol. So, they'll look at your driving patterns, they'll conduct some field sobriety tests, their observations, the admissions from the person that they've stopped. So they are able to, and we have prosecuted cases both with a combination of alcohol and cannabis, and also we have prosecuted cases where somebody has been impaired. So the real issue, people sometimes don't understand, they think it's just don't drink and drive, but it's really don't get in a car whether you've had prescription medication, cannabis, alcohol, anything that's going to impair your ability to safely operate that vehicle. You can get prosecuted for that.
But DA Abrams, can you convict somebody purely on the basis of cannabis if they're otherwise completely clean in terms of their drug tests?
If it caused them to have impaired driving where they could not safely operate the motor vehicle, we could.
Is that a bit of a heavier lift from a legal standpoint to prove that?
I would say it's a little bit, yes. Because like with alcohol, we have a certain standard. You can't drive with a
Right.
0.08 or higher, right? So we don't have that threshold in the state of California for marijuana. However, if there are such observations and the flunking of the field sobriety test, and we have those on video, so say the officer has body cam on, and
Right.
you can see how that person clearly isn't able to even correspond with the commands. And then if you have witnesses that were in other vehicles that saw the driving patterns, certainly that we put all those circumstances together to decide that we can file those charges.
Is that called DUI, or what is it called?
Yeah, it's driving under the influence of it's drugs or alcohol.
Okay, very interesting. And of course, marijuana now, cannabis, can have much higher THC levels than used to be the case, and people can get surprised by that.
Absolutely.
Now, how about if somebody is on a prescription opioid? Because the pendulum is swinging back against overprescribing them. But there was a time, 10, 15 years ago, where there was a perception that chronic pain was undertreated and people should be on Norco or Tylenol number 3, and that the side effects such as sedation become less with chronic use. Is it illegal to drive an automobile if you're taking Norco or Tylenol number 3?
If you're taking a prescription, certainly you should look at the prescription and say, it will say do not drive, or it will say it will make you drowsy. Anything that is going to affect your ability to safely operate a vehicle, you should not be driving while you're under the influence of any, whether it's prescription medication or whether it's illicit street drugs.
I completely agree, although I would point out if you read package inserts on medications, you'd be surprised how many have that warning that are really not sedating, so it's a pretty broad net to cast. Do you actually prosecute people for driving under the influence of, say, prescription opioids?
If we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that their ability to drive that car, that they were impaired, we can do that under prescription medication.
Okay, very good. Returning to marijuana, has the legalization of marijuana changed your experience as district attorney in terms of encountering people who are misusing or abusing the drug and getting in trouble, either with domestic violence or driving or other issues? Have you seen a change?
No, I think that we have more aggressive, we've seen more cases in terms of driving under the influence of marijuana, for sure.
Do we have gangs in Solano County that are trafficking marijuana now that it's legal?
We have gang activity in Solano County, I can tell you that.
Okay, and the gangs, I imagine they also are dealing with things like methamphetamine and fentanyl.
Absolutely. We definitely have fentanyl in this county as well.
Can you share anything with us about the gang activity? I realize some of this might be delicate and maybe something you're not at liberty to discuss, but are there quite a few gangs? Or, I know when I worked as a doctor in the prison system, we had various gangs, often along ethnic lines. We had Northern Hispanics, Southern Hispanics. We had neo-Nazi gangs. We had gangs that were primarily of other ethnic groups. And they traffic drugs in prison. Is what you see outside on the streets similar, or is it different?
I can say that we have gang activity throughout Solano County, and I think part of the problem is, Solano County sits on Interstate 80, right, this corridor. Right. So like we have Dixon, Vacaville, Fairfield, Vallejo, all along I-80, and so, it leads into San Francisco, leads into Richmond, up in Sacramento. So we definitely have drug trafficking, we have human trafficking, we have, on the Interstate 80. So I would say that it exists here in Solano County.
And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about fentanyl. I mean, we all know that the number of overdose deaths in the U.S. has been in the range of 100,000 per year. And you must be addressing that as a major priority, I would think, as district attorney, fentanyl abuse and methamphetamines.
We are, and especially, like I said, with the two-prong approach, we are aggressively going after those who are distributing and selling fentanyl in our community. And like we said, it's kind of like the Watson advisement, that if you know that you're selling drugs and you know it can kill someone and you continue to sell them and somebody dies, we can file up to murder charges on you. And at the same time, we're doing the outreach and the education prevention piece with our youth, because we're trying to show them. A lot of kids, I've lost, 3 friends of mine have lost their sons to fentanyl poisoning. And they thought they weren't buying fentanyl. They thought they were buying like an Oxycontin. And the next thing, they took 1 pill and they were dead. So we're really trying to get that message out to our youth. Do not take any drugs off the street, period, off of social media, from your friends, at a party. You don't know what's in it. And we're seeing fentanyl laced in all kinds of different pills and powder. We had a DA investigator, I know my lieutenant's here, and we had a DA investigator who's part of the federal task force, and they did a buy for 50,000 fentanyl pills, and they received 50,000 pills and 2 pounds of fentanyl powder here in Solano County.
You know, we've actually had 2 shows related to what we've discussed. One was interviewing the surviving mother of a young man who had died of a fentanyl overdose, and a similar show with a similar story with a gentleman whose son had died after using cannabis and becoming suicidal and having some psychosis, actually, with the high THC levels. So this is a subject that we've been interested in to a great extent here on the show. And it's hard to sort of tease out the law enforcement and medical without getting a little bit political. So I will ask you this. To the extent that we have had, for the last 4 years, until recently at least, really pretty much wide open borders with a lot of illegal immigration, do you view that as being related in some respect to the problems we're having in our community with fentanyl?
Well, like I said, the border enforcement is a federal issue. I mean, I, as the top law enforcement agent in Solano County, our job is to prosecute all the crimes that are committed within our jurisdiction in the Solano County area. So that's what I focus on, and all of our prosecutors focus on. But we have seen, I will say, we have seen a lot of fentanyl poisonings. We've had a lot of loss of life here in Solano County, and we've had a lot of drug trafficking with fentanyl. And it is a problem, and that's why we're really aggressively going after the prosecution of the dealers,
right,
and then also the outreach for our youth.
Now, I understand that you're in law enforcement rather than necessarily making federal immigration policy, so I appreciate that. Do you feel that as a community, there are other steps that we could be taking to minimize the impact of drugs, both prescription and illegal, on public order and the development of crimes and criminal activity? You kind of explained what you do in law enforcement, both education and prosecution, but what could the rest of us do in the community? Obviously, talking about it is one thing, but what else? But
I think it starts at home, right? It's like what we teach our kids. So I think it starts at home, having the conversations at home. I think it comes from the coach, the pastor, the neighbor, the friends. I think that people getting involved, volunteering, participating, because we can all just kind of talk about it, but like what I always tell people is, it doesn't become real, because we can talk about fentanyl, we can hear about it, we can read about it, but until you lose somebody that you love is when it becomes real. And so that's where hearing the stories from those that have lived it, I think, is really important to prevent the next person from losing their life.
Absolutely. With fentanyl too, one of the educational campaigns that we've discussed on the show is 1 pill can kill.
Right.
And because of the potency of the medication, there could be such a small amount in some counterfeit medication that is laced with fentanyl that a person could have respiratory collapse and die. And as you say, the person may not be part of the drug culture. The person could be a high school or college student who was handed what he or she thought was just a relatively safe medicine and a counterfeit pill. So I completely agree. Now, I understand that, again, this might be a little bit political, but what do you feel about risk minimization, let us say, through things like providing people with treatments to reverse overdoses with fentanyl, like Narcan.
Well, right. So when we go out with our outreach, we always have fire appear with us, and they talk about Narcan, and we talk about it because, you know, some college campuses have Narcan, some high schools have Narcan. Narcan cannot, and what we've learned from the public health officer is
Right.
that it can't hurt you.
Right.
It may not correct it, but it can't hurt you. So take it, right? So we're big believers in that, you know, having Narcan available, I think is we want to save lives, right?
Absolutely.
So that's the number one priority. And so we also tell the students, don't not call the police because you feel like you're going to get in trouble because you're at a party and one of your friends took a pill that they didn't know what was in it and now they're dying. So give them the Narcan and call 911 immediately, right? We want to save that life. So yes, we're not opposed to Narcan at all because it can save your life. And from what we've heard, it can't damage anything in your body.
No, medically, you're exactly right. And it's funny you should mention that because you met my son off air, Luke, who was an EMT in Washington, D.C., and they had their own EMT service called Georgetown Emergency Medical Rescue, or GERMS. And I may not have the name quite right, but they often responded to overdoses among students, and one of the messages that they tried to convey to the student body was, if you call for your friend who is overdosed, you're not going to get arrested for that.
Right.
And in college, a lot of that was fraternity initiation with accidental alcohol overdose. Because, you know, if you have somebody young who's never drunk and part of the initiation is to drink more and more vodka or gin or whatever, they could actually lapse into a coma and die from it. And it almost happened to a young man. They got there just in time. So this message of, you know, you won't be busted for calling it in, I
Right.
think is terribly important. Do you have any opinions on just drug legalization? I mean, it's interesting because prohibition is often cited as an example. And I remember hearing a talk given many years ago by Rudolph Giuliani in New York City when I was a resident. And everybody talked about how ineffective prohibition was. But he said, listen, most people followed the law, and when prohibition was repealed, cirrhosis of the liver became more common as people drank more. So what I would ask you, counsel, is what if we took an approach like the approach in Portugal, you may be familiar with, where they legalized everything, you know, and said, look, these are medical issues, let's not criminalize them, let's legalize all of it, and then we'll offer drug counseling. You know, I have my own feelings about that, but I feel I must ask you what you think about that.
Well, I think, you know, part of the problem is drug use. If you're in your home and you're using drugs, that's one thing, but when you're using drugs, it usually impacts other people, right? And so once you're harming other people or property, like we see a lot of theft and drug use go hand in hand, right? And so, you know, we've looked at two experiments. We've seen San Francisco and we've seen Oregon. My son and I were up in Oregon. He was almost going to transfer there, and all this open drug use, it doesn't look like it's working out well for Oregon or in San Francisco. So I don't know that works out well. I mean, I think that we have two experiments and they didn't work.
Do you have any suggestion for resources that people watching the show could reach out to learn more about available tools to prevent drug trafficking or drug abuse in our community, maybe websites or other sources that might be available?
Right. I mean, I always direct people to, I have a very open door policy, and I always tell people, get on our website, contact me, meet with me, get involved. And so we could list a number of resources that people can talk to, but we always are wanting anybody and everybody to get involved. Write us, call us, I meet with them. If it's about our youth, and it's about the safety of our youth, that's like one of our number one priorities at our office. So we're always making sure we're out there with our youth.
And as we begin to wind down, I should ask about the future. It seems that the whole drug thing is always changing. Like when I was in college, it was marijuana, which was less strong, and then heroin was there, and powder cocaine. It seems like those things have fallen out of fashion a bit, at least the powder cocaine, but now methamphetamine seems to have been supplanted to some extent by fentanyl, but they're still all out there. What do you see as you look at the future from the law enforcement perspective in terms of the challenges that we're going to be facing for illicit drug use? Do you see drugs emerging that we have to be really aware of you see problems that we have to kind of interdict now?
Well, I think like we talked about, like back in our day, like I try to tell my son and his friends, I'm like, marijuana back in the day is not like marijuana today. You don't know what's in it. Like you talked about the potency, you don't know if it's laced. And so that's the danger. And then I think that, we've always known about methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, but fentanyl is so fatal. It just is a couple of granules, right? It's such a different, it's lethal. And unfortunately, like in our county, we've seen more and more fentanyl poisoning. So I really think it's so dangerous for the police officers. So the officers go and they stop a car and they've got to search a car. If they're exposed to the fentanyl, that puts their lives at risk as well. So this is a new, greater risk for law enforcement dealing with the fentanyl crisis.
Yes, you could get an overdose transdermally just by touching it, or
That's
certainly
right.
by inhaling it. And with marijuana, I've seen at least one case at UC Davis of a young man who was admitted for severe, unrelenting vomiting, which also can occur. So I wish we could continue this conversation, but our time is running short. I'd just like to say in closing that I think that all of us on the show really appreciate your efforts as district attorney, not just to enforce the law, but to try to foster a culture in our community in which people can be healthy by avoiding drugs, avoiding excessive use of alcohol, and making all of the right decisions.
Right.
Thank you so much for being with us on Health Focus.
Thank you for having me.
We wish you all the best in your future efforts, and maybe we'll have you back and talk again.
I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Remember, here at Health Focus, we focus on your health. Today we focused on trying to stay healthy by fighting the battle against illicit drug use that could impair your health. And all of us will have different ideas about how best to accomplish that, but I think we can all agree that this is a conversation we have to continue to have for the benefit of our children and our community. So remember, stay healthy out there.